She said it the way one might request a second arrangement of hothouse flowers or an additional setting of fish forks, without emphasis, without heat, as though the matter were already decided and she were merely confirming a detail that had slipped between the cracks of an otherwise well-ordered evening. "Mrs. Quill, I shall need one additional place set for dinner this evening." The housekeeper stood in the doorway of the Duchess's private sitting room, her hands folded at her waist, her expression carefully neutral. Morning light fell through the tall windows and pooled across the writing desk where Cecily Vane sat with her correspondence arranged in precise stacks, invitations answered, invitations declined, household accounts initialed, and one letter that did not belong to any of those categories lying open beside her cup of chocolate. "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I place the setting at the far end, near Lady Pemberton?" "No." Cecily lifted her cup, drank, set it down. The chocolate had gone cold, but she gave no indication of having noticed. "Place it beside mine, directly beside mine, to my left." Mrs. Quill's hands tightened against each other, though her face betrayed nothing. She had served Pembridge Hall for 11 years, first under the old Duke, and now under his son, and she had learned long ago that the moments requiring the greatest discretion were never announced as such. They arrived in the ordinary voice, wearing the ordinary dress of household instruction, and one recognized them only by the silence that followed. "May I ask, Your Grace, for the place cards, the name?" "Lady Rowena Mast." The housekeeper did not move. She did not draw breath audibly or shift her weight or do any of the small involuntary things that lesser servants might have done upon hearing that name spoken aloud in the Duchess's own sitting room. She simply stood and waited, and after a moment Cecily looked up from her correspondence with an expression so composed it might have been carved from the same pale stone as the mantelpiece behind her. "That will be all, Mrs. Quill. The Sèvres, I think, not the Meissen, and the silver candelabra, the tall ones with the acanthus leaves. I want the table to look as though we expected her from the beginning." "Yes, Your Grace." Mrs. Quill withdrew. Cecily listened to the soft retreat of her footsteps down the corridor, counted to 10 in the silence that followed, and then picked up the letter that lay open beside her chocolate. It was not addressed to her. That was the first thing. It was addressed to Mr. Dorridge, the Duke's steward, in a hand that was elegant and practiced and bore the faint impression of violet scent, the kind of detail that might have seemed incidental to anyone who did not know that Lady Rowena Mast had worn violet scent at every assembly, every card party, every country dinner in the county of Hertfordshire for the past 7 months, until the fragrance had become as much her signature as the particular way she laughed or the particular angle at which she held her fan. The letter had arrived that morning in the General Post, mixed in among invoices from the wine merchant and a report from the tenant farm at Briar Hill. Dorridge had brought the morning's correspondence to Cecily, as he always did, the Duke being in London for the sitting of the House of Lords and not expected back until late afternoon. And it was Dorridge himself who had paused at the door, turned back, and said with the careful diffidence of a man who has served one household long enough to understand its architecture of silences, "Your Grace, there is a letter among the post that I believe was intended for my attention rather than yours. I thought it best you see it nonetheless." Cecily had thanked him. She had read the letter once, then twice, then a third time, with the slow deliberation of a woman who wished to be certain she had understood not merely the words but the presumption they carried. Lady Rowena Mast wrote to inform Mr. Dorridge that she had heard, from whom she did not say, that the Duke and Duchess of Pembridge were hosting a dinner on Saturday evening for a number of their neighbors. She expressed her earnest hope that she might be included among the company. She noted with a confidence that stopped just short of declaration that the Duke had spoken warmly of the evening and had given her to understand that her presence would not be unwelcome. She closed with a line that Cecily read 4 times. "I trust the Duke's wishes in the matter will be sufficient instruction." The Duke's wishes. As though Cecily were a housekeeper herself, an intermediary to be managed, a functionary whose approval was procedural rather than sovereign. As though the table were his to arrange, and the house his to open, and the guest list his to dictate, and the Duchess merely the woman who happened to sit at one end of it. Cecily folded the letter along its original creases and placed it in the shallow drawer of her writing desk, beneath a sheaf of blank correspondence cards. She did not tear it. She did not burn it. She placed it where she placed everything she intended to keep, neatly, precisely, in a location she could find again without searching. Then she rang for Mrs. Quill. The dinner had been Oliver's idea. He had proposed it a fortnight ago over breakfast, one of those bright April mornings when the light through the east-facing windows turned the breakfast room into something almost theatrical in its warmth, the silver gleaming, the marmalade catching the sun like amber. They might have some of the county to dinner, he said, the Pembertons, the Lacys, Sir George Frith and his new wife. It would do them good to be seen as settled, as established, as a household that entertained with confidence and regularity. Cecily had agreed. She had always agreed. She was, by temperament and by training, a woman who understood that a well-run house was a form of argument, that the quality of one's table and the precision of one's hospitality said more about the state of a marriage than any number of public declarations. What she had not known, on that bright April morning, was that Oliver's enthusiasm for the dinner had a secondary architecture, that the evening was not merely an exercise in county sociability, but a frame into which a particular guest might be inserted with the appearance of casualness. She had not known this because Oliver had not told her, and Oliver had not told her because Oliver believed, as men of his rank and generation so frequently believed, that certain arrangements existed in a separate territory from the marriage, running alongside it like a parallel corridor in a great house, visible from certain angles, but never quite intersecting with the principal rooms. Lady Rowena Mast had arrived in the county in September of the previous year. She was a widow. Sir Philip Mast had died of a fever in Naples, leaving her a modest jointure and a social ambition that exceeded it considerably. She had taken a house at Barton Green, 4 miles from Pembridge, and had set about making herself indispensable to the neighborhood with the methodical energy of a woman who understood that charm, properly deployed, was a form of capital. Cecily had received her. She had called on her, as custom demanded, and had found her clever and vivid and possessed of the kind of beauty that announced itself from across a room. Dark hair, sharp features, a mouth that seemed always to be suppressing some private amusement. She had thought, in those first weeks, that Lady Rowena might become a friend. There were so few women of real intelligence in the county, and Cecily had been lonely in ways she did not often permit herself to examine. The shift had been gradual. A glance held too long across a card table. A laugh directed exclusively at Oliver during a walk after church. A note of warmth in Oliver's voice when he mentioned Lady Rowena's opinions on the enclosures, on the new planting at Barton Green, on the particular excellence of her cook's syllabub. Small things, individually meaningless. Collectively, they formed a pattern as legible as print on a page, and Cecily read patterns the way other women read novels, quickly, accurately, and with full comprehension of the ending before it arrived. She had said nothing. She had watched the pattern deepen through the winter, the rides that happened to pass Barton Green, the invitations to tea that Oliver encouraged her to extend, the way he stood a little straighter when Lady Rowena entered a room. And she had said nothing, because saying something would have required her to name what she saw, and naming it would have made it real in a way that silence did not. Silence preserved the architecture. Silence kept the parallel corridor from intersecting with the principal rooms. And Cecily, who had been raised by Sir Edmund Ashton to understand that composure was the only currency a woman could spend without diminishing her reserves, held her silence like a hand of cards she had not yet decided whether to play. But the letter to Dorridge was not a private indiscretion. It was not a glance or a laugh or the faint trace of violet scent on a riding glove. It was a claim, a territorial assertion written on cream paper and sealed with red wax and sent through the public post to a servant of the house, as though the woman who governed that house were an obstacle to be circumvented rather than an authority to be acknowledged. It was Lady Rowena Mast saying, with the particular confidence of a woman who believes she has already won, "I belong at your table. Make room for me." And so Cecily would make room. She spent the morning in the dining room with Mrs. Quill, attending to the arrangements with the scrupulous attention she brought to every household endeavor. The table was long. It could seat 24 in full extension, though tonight they would be 12, now 13 with the addition. Cecily walked the length of it, adjusting the placement of each setting, checking the alignment of each glass, running her fingertip along the edge of the damask cloth to confirm it fell evenly on both sides. The additional place she positioned herself, lifting the Sèvres plate from Mrs. Quill's hands and setting it down with a deliberation that was almost ceremonial. To her left, close enough that their elbows might brush when reaching for the salt, close enough that every guest at the table would see them side by side, the Duchess and the woman whose name had been whispered in drawing rooms from Hertfordshire to London and back again, and would understand, in the particular way that the Tun understood everything, that this arrangement was not an accident. She wrote the place card herself in her own hand, which was small and precise, and bore none of the affected flourishes that fashionable women cultivated. Lady Rowena Mast. She placed it above the setting and stepped back and looked at the table as a painter might look at a canvas, assessing composition, balance, the relationship between each element and the whole. The morning light moved across the room as she worked, shifting from the east windows to the south, warming the mahogany sideboard and the portrait of the first Duchess of Pembridge that hung above it, a woman with steady eyes and a mouth that suggested she, too, had understood the uses of silence. The room smelled of beeswax polish and the faint green scent of the hothouse lilies that Cecily had ordered, arranged in a low centerpiece, low enough that every guest could see every other guest across the table without obstruction. She had been particular about this. She wanted no barriers. She wanted no merciful arrangements of foliage behind which embarrassment might hide. The table would be open and visible and legible, and every person seated at it would understand exactly what they were looking at. "It is well done, Mrs. Quill." "Yes, Your Grace." "When His Grace returns from London this afternoon, I should like to be informed. Do not mention the additional setting. I wish him to see it for himself." "Of course, Your Grace." Cecily withdrew to her sitting room and closed the door and sat in the chair by the window where the afternoon light would find her when it came, and she did not weep, and she did not pace, and she did not ring for her maid or write to her father or do any of the things that a woman in her position might have been forgiven for doing. She sat with her hands in her lap and her spine straight against the chair back, and she waited, the way one waits for weather, not with anxiety, but with the patient certainty that what was coming would arrive on its own terms and she would meet it as she met everything, upright and ready and entirely composed. Oliver returned at 4:30. She heard the carriage on the gravel, the particular crunch of iron-rimmed wheels on the raked drive that announced the family coach rather than the lighter gig used for local errands, and then his voice in the entrance hall speaking to Dorridge about a matter at the home farm, something about drainage and a boundary fence, the ordinary business of an estate that continued to require management regardless of what was happening in the private rooms above it. Then, his boots on the staircase, heavy and unhurried, the tread of a man who had no reason to believe that anything in his household had changed in his absence. He did not come to her sitting room. He went to his dressing room to change, and she listened to the sounds of his household moving around him, the valet's measured tread, the clink of a water pitcher, the soft closing of a wardrobe door, and she thought, as she had thought many times in the 3 years of their marriage, that the architecture of intimacy was mostly acoustic. One learned the rhythms of another person not through conversation, but through the sounds they made when they believed themselves unobserved. She knew the weight of his step when he was tired. She knew the pace of his movement when he was preoccupied. She knew, by the length of silence between the closing of the wardrobe and the opening of the dressing-room door, whether he had paused to look at himself in the glass, a vanity she found endearing and had never mentioned, because some observations were best kept as private possessions. He came downstairs at 6. She heard him cross the entrance hall and pause, the particular pause of a man remembering that he ought to look in on preparations, and then his footsteps moved toward the dining room. Cecily rose from her chair. She walked to the top of the staircase and stood there, one hand resting on the banister, looking down into the entrance hall, which was empty now except for the last of the evening light coming through the fanlight above the door. She did not descend. She waited. The dining room was visible from the entrance hall through a set of double doors that stood open in the evenings when the house was preparing to receive. Cecily could not see the table from where she stood, but she could see the light from the candelabra, the tall silver ones with the acanthus leaves, lit early on her instruction, throwing warm patterns across the far wall, and she could hear with the acoustics of a house she knew better than any room she had ever occupied, the exact moment when Oliver stopped moving. It was not a dramatic silence. There was no sharp intake of breath, no exclamation. There was simply a cessation, the sound of a man's footsteps ending not at a destination, but at a realization, the way one stops mid-sentence when the words one was about to speak are suddenly made irrelevant by something seen. She counted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 7 seconds of absolute stillness. Then she heard him say her name. Not loudly, not as a summons. He said it the way one says a word when one is alone in a room, and the word is not meant for anyone but oneself. Quietly, with the particular weight of a man who has just understood something he should have understood months ago. Cecily. She descended the staircase. She crossed the entrance hall. She entered the dining room and found him standing at the head of the table with his hand resting on the back of his chair, looking down the length of the damask cloth at the 13 place settings, at the Sèvres china and the silver candelabra and the crystal glasses catching the candlelight, and at the place card positioned to the left of the Duchess's seat, written in the Duchess's own hand, bearing the name of the woman he had permitted to believe she had a claim on his attention, his time, his household, and, by implication, his marriage. Oliver looked at the table. He looked at the place card. He looked at Cecily, who stood in the doorway with her hands clasped at her waist, wearing the dove-gray silk she had chosen for the evening. Not her finest gown, not a deliberate weapon, simply the dress she would have worn to any dinner of moderate importance, because this dinner was in the end a dinner of moderate importance. "You have set a place for Lady Rowena," he said. "I have. Beside yours." "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. The candles made small sounds, the faint hiss of tallow, the occasional pop of a wick, and somewhere in the house a clock struck the half-hour. Oliver's hand tightened on the back of his chair, and Cecily watched his fingers press into the wood and then release, press and release, as though he were negotiating with himself about what to say and finding every option insufficient. "She wrote to Dorridge," he said finally. "Yes." "You read the letter?" "Dorridge brought it to me, as was proper." Oliver closed his eyes. When he opened them, his expression had changed, not dramatically, not with the theatrical remorse that lesser men might have performed, but with the quiet devastation of a man who has been confronted not with an accusation, but with a mirror, and has seen in it exactly what he hoped he would never have to see. "I did not invite her," he said. "I did not ask Dorridge to. I would not have—" He stopped. He looked at the place card again, at Cecily's handwriting, at the precision of her letters, and something in his face broke open like a lock giving way. "She presumed." "Yes," Cecily said. "She did." "And you set her a place." "I set her the place she asked for, beside mine, where everyone could see." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Cecily had ever heard in that room, louder than any argument, any accusation, any scene that might have been made by a woman less practiced in the art of making her meaning felt without raising her voice. Oliver stood at the head of his table, in his dining room, in the house that bore his name and his family's name and the name of every Duke of Pembridge who had come before him, and he looked at the evidence of his wife's composure and understood, as clearly as if she had spoken the words aloud, that she had known everything for months and had said nothing and was saying nothing still, and that her silence was not ignorance or acceptance, but the most precise and devastating form of communication available to a woman who had decided that words were beneath the dignity of the point she was making. "Cancel the dinner," he said. Cecily did not move. "The dinner is your occasion, Oliver. You proposed it. If you wish to cancel it, you will instruct Dorridge yourself, and you will write the letters of apology yourself. I have set the table as you required. My part is done." He looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze without defiance, without accusation, without any of the emotions that might have given him something to push against, something to argue with, something to reshape into a narrative in which he was merely misunderstood rather than wrong. There was nothing to push against. There was only the table and the place card and the woman who had written it. "I will write to Lady Rowena tonight," he said. "She will not be received." "That is your decision to make." "Cecily, the Pembertons arrive at 7:30. You will want to dress." She turned and left the dining room. She climbed the staircase with the same measured tread she had descended it, her hand trailing along the banister, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingers. The same banister she had gripped on the morning she first arrived at Pembridge as a bride, uncertain of everything except her own capacity to endure whatever the house and its master required of her. She went to her dressing room and sat before her mirror and looked at her own reflection, gray silk, pearl earrings, hair dressed simply with no ornament, and she permitted herself, in the privacy of that room with the door closed and no one to see, a single long breath, not of relief, not of triumph, simply the breath of a woman who has done a difficult thing well and knows it, and who understands that the difficult thing is not yet finished, but that the worst of it, the waiting, the not knowing whether the gesture would be read correctly, is over. The dinner was canceled. Oliver wrote the letters himself, as Cecily had required, sitting at his desk in the library with Dorridge standing by to arrange the deliveries. He wrote to the Pembertons with regret. He wrote to the Lacys with apology. He wrote to Sir George Frith with the particular brevity of a man who is conscious of the inadequacy of his excuses. And he wrote to Lady Rowena Mast. Cecily heard him in the library for over an hour. She heard the scratch of his pen, the occasional silence when the pen lifted and did not immediately descend, the sound of paper being set aside. Discarded drafts, she supposed, attempts at language that fell short of whatever it was he was trying to say, or trying not to say. She heard Dorridge's voice once, low and deferential, and Oliver's reply, a single word, clipped, which she could not make out. When the letters were sealed and given to Dorridge for the morning post, Oliver did not come upstairs. She heard him pour a glass of something from the sideboard in the library, and then the house was quiet, and she understood that he was sitting alone in a room that smelled of ink and candle smoke, and the particular shame of a man who has discovered that the woman he underestimated has outmaneuvered him without raising a single weapon he knew how to defend against. Cecily did not ask to see the letter to Lady Rowena. She did not need to. She knew what it would contain because she knew Oliver, knew that his pride, once confronted with its own reflection, would do the work that argument never could. He was not a cruel man. He was not even, in the conventional sense, a faithless one. He was a man who had permitted a flattering attention to grow into something more substantial than he intended, and who had failed to see, or had chosen not to see, that the growth had a cost, and that the cost was being paid not by him, but by the woman who had stood in the dining room doorway in dove-gray silk, and said nothing that needed to be said, because the table had said it for her. Lady Rowena Mast left the county before the month was out. The gossip preceded her departure by several days. Mrs. Pemberton mentioned it to Cecily over tea with the studied casualness of a woman who has been waiting for an opportunity to mention it, and Cecily received the information with a nod and a request for more sugar, which communicated everything that needed to be communicated about how much importance she attached to the matter. The house at Barton Green was let to a retired admiral and his wife, who kept to themselves and grew excellent roses, and never once occasioned a whisper in any drawing-room in the county. Mrs. Quill mentioned the final departure in the course of reviewing the week's household accounts, mentioned it the way one mentions a change in the weather or an adjustment to the butcher's delivery schedule, as a fact of minor domestic significance, already absorbed into the ordinary rhythm of the house. There were those in the county who wondered what had happened. The dinner that was announced, and then cancelled, Lady Rowena's abrupt removal to Bath, the Duke and Duchess of Pembridge, who continued to appear at church on Sundays and at assemblies on Thursdays, with the serene regularity of a household that had weathered nothing more dramatic than a change of season. The ton talked, as the ton always talked, but the talk found no purchase on the smooth surface of Cecily's composure, and eventually it moved on to fresher subjects, an elopement in Surrey, a bankruptcy in Hampshire, and Pembridge Hall was left in the peace that Cecily had earned and Oliver had learned to deserve. Oliver did not speak of Lady Rowena again. He did not, in the weeks and months that followed, offer the kind of explicit apology that some wives might have demanded, the confession, the enumeration of faults, the promise of reform. What he offered instead was something that Cecily, who had never trusted promises, valued more, a change in the texture of his attention. He began to notice things. The way she arranged the flowers in the library, always white in spring because her mother had done the same, the book she was reading, and whether she had finished it, and what she thought of the ending. The particular quality of her silence at breakfast, which was not cold but contemplative. The silence of a woman who was thinking about the day's household management, or the letter she owed her father, or the new planting she had discussed with Dorridge for the south border of the garden. He began to sit in her sitting room in the evenings, not every evening, but often enough that his presence there stopped feeling like an event and began to feel like a habit, which was better. He read while she worked at her correspondence. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not. The silence between them changed, lost its careful architecture, its parallel corridors, and became instead the simple quiet of two people who were in the same room because they wished to be, not because custom or obligation or the design of the house placed them there. In June, he came to her sitting room with a letter he had received from the Lord Chancellor regarding a matter before the House of Lords, a proposed amendment to the poor laws that had been debated throughout the spring session and which had divided opinion sharply among the peers. Oliver had spoken in the chamber twice on the matter already, and the position he had taken, favoring relief over restriction, had earned him admirers in some quarters and critics in others. He asked Cecily her opinion, not as a courtesy, not as the kind of performative consultation that husbands sometimes offered their wives to demonstrate a modern temperament they did not actually possess. He asked because the matter was complex and because Cecily's mind was precise, and because he had begun to understand that the woman he had married was not merely composed but formidable, and that her composure was not the absence of opinion, but the discipline of a mind that refused to speak until it had something worth saying. She gave her opinion. He listened. He disagreed on one point and told her so, and they argued about it, properly argued with evidence and reasoning and the particular energy of two intelligent people who cared about the same thing for different reasons. And when it was over, he looked at her across the sitting room with an expression she had not seen before or had not recognized before, which was perhaps the same thing. "You should have told me," he said. She understood that he was not speaking about the poor laws. "You knew," she said. "You did not need to be told. I needed to be shown." "Yes," she said. "You did." He crossed the room and sat beside her on the settee and took her hand, not with the theatrical urgency of a man making a grand gesture, but with the quiet deliberation of a man picking up something he had set down carelessly and discovering it was more valuable than he remembered. They sat together in the evening light, and Cecily thought that this, the weight of his hand around hers, the sound of his breathing beside her, the ordinary miracle of being known and knowing in return, was worth more than any declaration, any scene, any confrontation that might have cleared the air more quickly, but would have cost them both something that could not be recovered. The dining room table was reset for 12 the following Saturday. The Pembertons came, and the Lacys, and Sir George Frith and his new wife, and the evening was warm and well lit and unremarkable in every way except one. Oliver watched Cecily across the table with the particular attention of a man who has learned, recently and at some cost, to see what is in front of him, and Cecily met his gaze with the composure she had always possessed, but which meant something different now, not a shield but a choice, not a defense but a gift, the quiet assurance of a woman who had shown her hand and found it sufficient. By autumn, the house at Pembridge had settled into a rhythm that visitors remarked upon without quite being able to name. Sir Edmund Ashton, visiting from Kent, observed that his daughter looked well. That was the word he used, well, by which he meant something more specific than health, something closer to the particular luminosity that a woman acquires when she is seen clearly by the person who matters most, and is not diminished by the seeing. He did not ask what had changed. He was not a man who required explanations for things he could observe for himself. He kissed his daughter's cheek in the entrance hall when he departed and said, "You have made a fine house here, Cecily." And she understood that he was not speaking about the house. The following spring, in the same sitting room where she had read Lady Rowena's letter and rung for Mrs. Quill and set in motion the most eloquent evening of her marriage, Cecily told Oliver that she was with child. He received the news with a stillness she recognized, the same cessation she had heard from the top of the staircase on the night of the dinner that never was, the sound of a man stopping not at a destination, but at a realization. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair and pressed his forehead to her hands and stayed there, not speaking, for a long time. And she rested her fingers in his hair and looked out at the garden where the early crocuses were pushing through the frost, and thought that some things did not need to be said, had never needed to be said, and that the deepest conversations of a marriage were conducted not in words but in gestures, a place set at a table, a hand taken in an evening room, a man kneeling beside a chair in the spring light with his forehead pressed to the hands of the woman who had taught him, with silverware and linen and silence, what it meant to be worth choosing. Their daughter was born in November, in the same bedchamber where 4 generations of vain children had entered the world. Oliver held her before the cord was cut, an irregularity the physician frowned upon, and Mrs. Quill permitted with the particular authority of a housekeeper who understood that some rules existed to be observed and some existed to be quietly set aside. They named her Eleanor, after Oliver's grandmother, and Cecily watched him hold her, this man who had once permitted another woman to believe she had a claim on his household, and saw in his face the expression of a person who has finally understood the dimensions of what he possesses and will never again mistake its value. Years later, when Eleanor was old enough to sit at the long table in the dining room and young enough to find the formality of it thrilling, Cecily would sometimes look down the length of the damask cloth, the same candelabra, the same Sèvres china that had been laid out on the evening that never was. And she would remember the morning she had placed a 13th setting beside her own and written a name on a card in her own precise hand and waited for her husband to see it. She did not remember it with bitterness. She did not remember it with triumph. She remembered it with the particular clarity of a woman who understood that the most important moments of a life were rarely the ones that looked important from the outside, that they arrived in the ordinary voice, wearing the ordinary dress of household instruction, and one recognized them only by what came after. The table at Pembridge seated 12 on those evenings. It had always seated 12. There had never been a 13th place, and there never would be again. And the absence of that place, the space where it might have been, the silence where its occupant might have spoken, was the most eloquent thing Cecily Vane had ever said. They arrive here, like a place set at a table no one expected, whenever they are ready.